Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full PreFrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. I am here, as always, with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. Good to be with you, as always. So today, you're going to kick us off by talking about the widow, the orphan, and the stranger.
Yes, so it's interesting, huh? Widow, Orphan, and the Stranger. So recently I read two books by Reverend Gregory J. Boyle. He is the founder of Homeboys Industries in Los Angeles. It's the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world. Today we are going to talk about charismatic adult and the role of a charismatic adult. And reading his book, Tattoos on the Heart, kind of made that connection for me that he is the charismatic adult present in lives of so many. So, Father Boyle has said that there's a lethal absence of hope in many places where he dwells. And what he is really, really good at or does so effervescently or has done for the last 30 years in the urban parts of Los Angeles is offer boundless compassion to those who have experienced a setback or who have been refused or denied dignity. Once he was asked why he does what he does, and he replied that somewhere in the scriptures it says, do it for the widow, the orphan, or the stranger. And that's why the reference that how can we offer our boundless compassion and become this amazing charismatic adult for children, or even in this case, adults who have a lot of setbacks. And that's kind of a role of resilience in our life that allows us to do that. Another quick story that reminded me in the context of education is Escalante. Jaime Escalante was a teacher also in Los Angeles, and he was doing two things right. He was giving more time to students, and he was giving them a lot of encouragement. And he was a teacher in inner city school where children came from gangs and they came from broken homes. They came from deep poverty. And most inner cities everywhere in the country were doing poorly except his classroom, his school. And there were some things that he was doing and he was getting it right, that he had high expectations of every child. He was teaching kids how to take exams seriously. And in fact, he was teaching them how to take a test and how to kind of show up when the test is posing a challenge and how to answer those questions. And finally, he was creating a community atmosphere, a spirit of team and family where everybody was part of the team and everybody had to beat the system, beat the challenge, and become the A student that he was capable of. So that's what we are here to talk about today. And who better than my guest who can shed some light on these amazing aspects of resilience, inner human, undying source that allows us to rise and shine and go above and beyond our own expectations. And how can a charismatic adult help with that? So let's get started with that. Dr. Robert Brooks is my guest today, and he's a psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. And he was the former director of the Department of Psychology at McLean Hospital, a private psychiatric hospital. He also has lectured nationally and internationally and written extensively about such themes as motivation, resilience, school and work climate, parenting, and family relationships, and balancing our personal and professional lives. He is the author or co-author of 17 books, including some of my favorite ones, which is Raising Resilient Children, The Power of Resilience, Achieving Balance, Confidence, and Personal Strength in Your Life, Handbook of Resilient Children, and so on and so forth. I've had the privilege to meet him in person many times, and especially gotten to know his work and hands-on workshops that he does. He's an unbelievable human being to be with and a true inspiration. So I'm so thrilled to have him.
Well, I have to tell you, Sucheta, that the story of Jaime Escalante and is such an inspiring story. And the film, starring Edward James Olmos and Lou Diamond Phillips, is such a great inspirational tale. And I'll be honest with you, I've never thought about that story in the context of resilience. But Now I can't think of it any other way, because talk about resilient teachers and students. Fascinating way to think about that. Well, this is going to be a fascinating conversation. Let's get to it. Here is Sucheta's conversation with Dr. Bob Brooks.
Dr. Robert Brooks, welcome to the podcast Full PreFrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. I am very delighted to have you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with resilience. When we talk about executive function, we often talk about three important key components: the capacity to control impulses, working memory, and mental flexibility. I feel resilience addresses at least two, if not all three ingredients of the successful self-management and strong executive function. Can you start us off with the definition of resilience, and how do researchers study resilience? Because most often we witness resilience in action, or we witness post-traumatic event or post-challenge. So can you shed some light on that?
Certainly. First of all, without wanting to be overly simplistic, resilience for me is the capacity to bounce back from adversity. It doesn't mean you're not going to face adversity, but when difficult situations arise, you have the ability to, and that's where it ties to executive function, you have the ability to think before you act. You have the ability to regulate your emotions and to really then think through solutions to different problems. Most of the research, initial research on resilience, looked at people, especially as children, who had undergone great adversity. They grew up in war zones, they were abused, they had great difficulty in school. And then the question was raised, what helps these people to bounce back as they grow and develop? In my work, I've actually taken a broader stance and said, what we learn from people who have faced adversity and overcome that adversity, why can't we apply to all individuals? So that's why I basically started asking the question, how does a resilient person see the world and themselves differently from others? And what are the skills that they possess that people who are not resilient do not possess?
I see. And I'm going to quickly throw in a funny situation. Yesterday, we had a guy come in to instill a electric fence around the house so that our dog can roam around freely. And he came to give the instructions and train us with the dog. Same time, a pizza delivery guy came to deliver pizzas to the house. And my husband, with the dog on on the leash on one hand, and then opened the door and took the pizza boxes on the other. And the dog jerked him, and both the boxes fell flat, upside down. And the pizza delivery man looked at my husband looked at me looked at, I looked at the pizza delivery man, and I just had to give the cue that it's okay. I said, honey, it's totally fine. Anyway, it's going to all go in the stomach. And once my cue came, everybody was relieved.
Wow, you have a lovely way of lessening stress right away. What you did there, of course, also is, you have to put things in perspective. And as you described it, I started to laugh because I could just picture what happened there. Resilience comes in, in all forms. I mean, it really has to do, for me, with how effectively one copes. And that's where, as I say, it ties a lot to executive functioning. But the other thing is, I think almost from birth, if we look at what are the components of what I call a resilient mindset, we can help children to develop that at a young age, but it goes throughout the whole lifespan. I've applied my work to children, adults into our senior years, and what helps us to be resilient and what helps to find some meaning and purpose to our lives. So the concept.
So what are the components you would say? So one is to find meaning and purpose. So you never lose the anchor.
Yeah, I would even like to get into more detail. One of the things that's of interest to me, and I could spend hours on this, but I'll just summarize it is, and I really emphasize this more and more in my work, that in order to be resilient, you have to feel that you're making a positive difference in the life of others. And we could start at a very early age. In research I did related to school climate, one of the best memories people have of school is when they were asked to help out. And as you look at that, when I work with people around what helps people to be resilient, I always look at, does this person, whether they're 5 years old or 75 years old, feel that they're helping out or making a difference? Another key component is how we deal with mistakes. That's why story, if we look at it in terms of a mistake that took place, is resilient people see mistakes as things to learn from, while people who are not as resilient become very frustrated and often feel they'll always make mistakes. They'll often back away from things. They'll use coping strategies that are not as effective. There's wonderful research taking place that I use in therapy and that I suggest people, teachers use in classrooms, that one has to really prepare people for obstacles. So in my therapy work, when we work out strategies, say with the patient of whatever age, I'm always asking, what obstacles do you think may come up and how are we going to deal with these obstacles?
This reminded me, one of the training components that when I train parents, I feel that there are two parts that if kind of combined together, that parents can create an environment that promotes resilience. What I say is structure is really essential. So there's some sort of predictability and consistency in the household. And then I ask parents to slowly introduce a wrench. A wrench is a planned interruption where child is told that there's something we're going to plan, but the plan may not go per plan. And then that wrench comes such as, we're going to go to Six Flags. And that's a plan for Saturday. And then parents get up and say, I'm so sorry, but the plans have been canceled. We're going to go to Six Flags tomorrow. And then that becomes a lesson of learning how to adjust to this unanticipated interruption or a roadblock. And in my practice, I see so many kids and even youngsters, young adults, completely bent out of shape when things don't go per plan, or the smallest interruption completely throws them off. So what you're saying really strikes a chord with me.
Yeah, it's a very important thing. And how you worded it is just lovely. I think there are too many kids who really don't know how to deal with setbacks. Sometimes, or a lot of times, in my experience, parents, very loving parents, will rush in and solve problems for kids rather than having the kids learn how to solve it themselves. So by basically saying, there are these wrenches or these obstacles, and then saying, let's think about how we're going to deal with it. Think about the skills. You have to think before you act. You have to be a good problem solver. You have to anticipate, what may come up. You have to think of different options that come up. It's impossible to be resilient if you're not able to cope effectively, with mistakes. The other thing that ties to, and, what you had brought up is one of the key characteristics of resilient people throughout the lifespan is resilient people learn to focus on what they have control over rather than things they have no control over at all. Once when I mentioned that, someone said that's like the serenity prayer. But one of the things I have found is if a person keeps basically what I will say is a victim mentality, like, why did I have to have this problem? Or why did I have to be born, with problems learning? If they continue to say, why me? It is very difficult for them to move ahead. But with people I've seen, say, with executive functioning problems, if they can move beyond saying, I have trouble, planning, or I have trouble with some other kinds of activities, and they then move to the mindset, but I had no control over being born with some of these problems. What I have control over is my attitude and response to it. And that is really a resilient person. There's research to show adults with learning differences who constantly say, why did I have to be born with a learning difference, are going to do much more poorly in life than someone who says, I had no control over being born with a learning difference. What I have control over is how can I learn to really adjust to it, to deal with it in a productive way.
And this reminds me of a lot of research about children with dyslexia or, learning disability. When they go to special schools where all the children have the similar diagnosis, they tend to do better in terms of the way they relate to their own learning challenges, learning differences. I find in my work that many, many kids who come to my practice in their late adolescence, even young adulthood, when they are in high school or college, they have completely, skated with this notion that I'm smart, I'm capable, I'm brilliant. And now people want so much from me that I don't care. So they have really used their intelligence to do well on tests, but they never have developed the discipline to study properly or organize themselves or take notes or develop all those skills that make you more accountable to yourself. And then suddenly somebody tells them that you have a diagnosis of ADHD or executive dysfunction, and they are discombobulated. They have tremendous difficulty accepting that, and they come from that fixed mindset that I cannot be the one. Why me? Why now?
Yeah, well, you see, what you just brought up is very important. When a diagnosis is used, and kids find out diagnoses, what the message should be is, and I'll give you an actual example of a 9-year-old boy who asked me, why did God choose me to be the one with ADHD? So already he was somewhat in a victim mentality, like I was chosen by God, this is terrible. And one of the things I said is, now that we know you have ADHD, the good thing is that there are things and actions we can take and you can take which will help you with it. So the diagnosis is all right. You don't want someone to take it and almost like, feel like, see, I'm ruined for life. But instead, you always want to create a problem-solving attitude. I always say in my work that resilient people see problems as things to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. So when there is a problem, you don't want the person to feel like I will never overcome this, like a fixed mindset, but instead to look at what are the strategies I can use to deal with this problem. And it's a very important thing. If any child or adult faces a task and feels they're going to fail, years ago, Martin Seligman talked about the notion of learned helplessness, then they're just going to give up. I think it's our job as parents, as educators, as therapists, to look at how do we change mindsets so that people see problems as things they can learn from and that they can cope more effectively with.
Yeah, you make a very important point. I think I find this a lot, that several practices I'll mention, that a child is experiencing a difficulty in his academic learning from kindergarten to, let's say, 12th grade. And then this kid eventually goes to college. But it's, number one, other people are noticing these challenges, and they are informing the child that this is a problem, or they are reporting to each other or to parents. The child is rarely in that conversation. Secondly, I think then when the diagnosis happens, for example, a child goes to an educational psychologist or neuropsychologist and they get a diagnosis, the results are never discussed clearly with the child. And most importantly, as you said, the diagnosis is never delivered as a powerful tool that says, hey, listen, now we know why you are having trouble. This is so much better. When I do training, one of the things I'm always keeping in the forefront is your brain is trainable. It's an amazing instrument. We just need to polish it and practice it and polish it and use it. So sounds like you are encouraging that, giving them power to recognize their own power.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, what you just brought up just resonates with me. For years, I worked at a psychiatric hospital and we did a lot of evaluations of kids. And the same thing, sometimes, you do, and if they were inpatients, even more so. And sometimes what I started to believe is the kids, while they were the ones who had all this testing, sometimes were left out of the feedback session. So what I actually started to do is I always had to write a report for the parents in the school, but I also would write like a 1-page letter to the child or the adolescent, basically summarizing things, mentioning why the child's seeing me, mentioning some of the areas that were problematic, but also I always would put in the steps we could start to take. What that did was, and some parents have told me that their child held on to that report into their adult lives. What that did was it really started to empower the child to understand his or her problems, but also provided a sense of hope because there were things that could be done. And it wasn't a mystery anymore. I mean, one of the things that is overwhelming is I've often asked my audiences, did any of you ever face a problem that you didn't even know where to start? And everyone raises their hand. All of us have. And I said, imagine if almost any problem you faced, you felt that way. And that is how a number of children and adults feel. So they get overwhelmed. They can't think of solutions to problems. So the more we can develop in children and adults the notion that when problems arise, there can be solutions. We can think about the obstacles. We can think about what are the ways of problem solving, people feel in my writings, I call it a greater sense of personal control over your own life. And I have found it's one of the most powerful features of resilience at any age.
Bob, that speaks so much to my heart. I think this personal letter is an amazing method, and I'm going to highly encourage even parents to do that. How about parents who are raising children and they themselves are facing obstacles in raising that child who's going through difficulties? Maybe they can even practice writing a little blurb that the child can look up and read and kind of relate to and find that becomes a whole a resource for finding hope within these difficult situations. So as you are giving us an overview of what qualities the resilient mind possesses, you were saying that they have a sense of purpose, they are very good at dealing with mistakes, then they are also much more ready to tackle the problems with a problem-solving mindset. Anything else they do very well?
Well, I want to mention something that is the basic foundation even before those. In all the research that's been done on resilience, when researchers have asked people who have overcome adversity and are now much more hopeful and optimistic, and when they've asked, what do you think was the most important thing in your childhood or adolescence, as difficult as it was, for you to be more hopeful and optimistic now? The number one answer in all the research is there was at least one person along the way who truly believed in me and stood by me. And I'm mentioning this because one of my heroes who died a number of years ago in psychology, his name was Julius Siegel. He called that person a charismatic adult in a child's life. And although the word charismatic is often misunderstood, his definition was that is an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. And I'll just add, even as adults, we need charismatic adults. The reason I want to emphasize this is I think nowadays there's so much emphasis on different mindsets and changing fixed to growth mindsets and, some wonderful research. But I think what is often lost is the first strategy one should think about is how do I develop a relationship with a child or an adult where they feel comfortable, where they trust us and whatever. And I sometimes have felt with high stakes testing and so many other things, we lose sight of that. You've heard this before or said in different ways. Children don't care what you know until they first know you care. So actually, in my workshops, I actually spend the beginning of my workshops and presentations focusing on the relationship. It's out of the relationship that a resilient mindset can develop.
So charismatic adult, and I have heard you speak about that many times, but for our listeners, I think this is such an intriguing and important concept that the responsibility begins with the adult in the child's life rather than fully and solely depending on the child showing up with all these skills and capacities to become even further resilient. So can you give us, I've heard you talk about these self-check questions, the inventory of questions you can ask yourself to see if you are a charismatic adult for someone in your life, or particularly a child. Can you walk us through some of these?
Well, one of the things is, when I read it, when Julius Siegel, the psychologist, used the term, I started thinking about what helps us to be a charismatic adult, what helps people to feel that they can trust us with kids. So one of the things, another major part of my workshops has to do with the whole issue of empathy. Because in order to be a charismatic adult, you really have to think about how you come across. So I ask questions like this, and anyone could think about it. It could be a parent, it could be a teacher, a therapist. How would I hope this child describe me? What words would I hope this child use to describe me? What do I say and do on a regular basis so that the child is likely to use these words to describe the words I hope they use, that they will actually use? Right from the start, I asked, after just one meeting with a child, what if we interviewed the child and asked them to describe the meeting and what they thought about us, what would they say? And then, because I always believe in action plans, what do we intentionally say or do so that the child is likely to describe us after even just one meeting in a way we would hope they described us? So there's a whole host of questions I really started to ask. for people to start to think about this, every time we interact with a child or an adult, that other person forms words and images to describe us. And we should think very seriously, what do we want them to be? If we want to be a charismatic adult in a child's life, then we have to think about, we want them to trust us. But I get very specific. How, in what way? Some research I found was we want them to feel we're accessible, that we're accessible to them. Well, how is that shown? So it really gets us to think about the impact we are having on the life of another child. If we have to, in any way, give feedback that, to a child, how do we do it in a way where they can hear? Another couple of my favorite questions is, in anything we say or do, what do we hope to accomplish? And are we saying or doing in a way where the other person is most likely to hear us? Because I've actually read interviews where right away everyone gets defensive. Or when I meet
yes.
Where I meet with parents, I will say to them, especially after I've done an evaluation, that I'm going to go over some things. And I say this, if anything I say does not sound like their son or daughter, please let me know. It's not that you're right or I'm right or you're wrong or I'm wrong, but together we can figure out why we may have these differences. So there are questions which really start to create what I call in my writings a motivating environment, an environment where everyone really wants to work together. And I also, one other question which I have used for years, which many people have told me, is just, just very helpful, is this. I say to them, if I ask you a question and you're not certain why I'm asking, don't answer the question. Ask me why I'm asking. And the reason I do that is too often the questions we raise, kids or their parents or adults really are not certain why we're asking. And an example I give is, I ask people, have you ever had a doctor ask you a question and you wonder why they're asking? It just creates more anxiety. And the whole approach I take is, I want, whether it's a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old, I want them to really feel they're collaborating with me in terms of helping them to become more resilient.
So I'll give you my list of things, what I would like people to say about me, particularly children when I'm dealing with them, that I would like them to think that I am patient and I'm accessible and I'm thoughtful. I'm eager to help. I'm knowledgeable and I'm willing to collaborate and change my mind. I would love that to come across. So you've given me a lot to think about that. How do I confirm that they feel that way about me?
Right, because I love the words you use, and just knowing you're a little, I think the people you work with would describe you in that way. But then, when I have more like it's an hour or so with a client or I'm supervising, I will then take each of those and say, what are one or two things you think you do, recognizing that every kid we see and every parent or adult may have different impressions, but what are one or two things you specifically do that is likely for them to describe you in that way. I always, having done a lot of supervision of mental health professionals and educators, I really like to get very nitty gritty in that regard. And the same thing when I work with parents. If they say, I want my kid to, whatever, loving. I mean, it's such a broad term. I say, what are one or two things? I want my kids to think I'm accessible to them or I'm supportive. Okay, what are one or two things you might do? What I've been told is questions like that really get you to reflect on your role and how you are coming across and help you to become that charismatic adult in a child's life.
This sounds to me like a theory of mind issue. I think reading the minds of others, understanding others' intentions, behaviors, beliefs, and then adjusting and tweaking our own behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs, or responding in a particular way. So it's a song and dance of reading the minds of others. And I find that when I work with parents, particularly those on the spectrum or those who have, complex diagnosis, the parents themselves don't have the highest form of empathy. They are not good at reading minds of others. They're not very good at doing an internal check that, am I presenting myself in a way that I claim myself to be? So how do we redirect those people who lack the awareness to have these skills where you become more charismatic person? Not that you lack the capacity, but they just don't have the insight into themselves.
Well, part of it is I share my philosophy, if you will, a theory of mind, if you will, with others. So if I'm asking parents to think about how they come across, I ask for very specific examples. But one of the things about how they relate to their kids, but your comment has stirred up so many different thoughts. So I'll try to be as coherent as I can here. Because one, I explain to parents why empathy is important, putting yourself in the shoes of another person. Two is we will often go over, because I find you need concrete examples for people to learn. And what your comment triggered also is, one of my books is called Raising Resilient Children with Autism Spectrum Disorders. And the very diagnosis of being on the autism spectrum suggests that the person, that child or if adult, has difficulty with empathy, because empathy is both a cognitive skill. You have to put yourself in the perspective of another person, take another perspective, and it's an affective skill or emotional. You have to know what emotions are about. So what your comment brings up is, how do you promote greater empathy in people, one, who have not basically used it, either because they themselves have not learned to be empathic, or it's been difficult because, let's say, some are on the autism spectrum. Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, and empathy is an important part of emotional intelligence, in his book Emotional Intelligence says he feels empathy can be learned. And others feel you can start helping people be empathic. So a little long-winded, but in terms of your response, it's a process. Let's say I'm working with parents or teachers. It's a process of, let's put ourselves in the child's shoes. Now, sometimes I've heard from parents and teachers explanations that they have of why a child acts the way they do that really work against developing a greater relationship. I've actually heard this, my child is always trying to provoke me. My child doesn't really care, on and on. One of the things I've learned is, in helping parents or teachers or others be empathic towards children, you have to be empathic towards them. So another guiding principle in my work is, when I hear people give their explanation of why they think kids are acting in a certain way, and I know it's working against developing a good relationship, I will say that is one way of thinking about things, because I really avoid saying I disagree with that, and I really avoid saying that's not a very good idea. I will say that's one way of thinking about things. May I share with you another way? Because if you make people more defensive, they're not going to be able to hear what you have to say at all. They're just going to get even more and more defensive. So over the years, I've looked at the many situations that I felt I did not handle very well. And then I asked myself, in what ways could you have handled it differently? Because what it gets to is, what do you hope to accomplish, but are you saying or doing in a way where the other person will be most likely to hear you?
So, you know what? It sounds to me that it boils down to how well are we able to manage other people's emotions? Because if we are attuned with their emotions and then we recognize the impact our conversation, our style, our verbiage is going to have on them, and we are able to change and shift, then we are going to likely to reach them, impact them more positively. So a lot of this, again, the metacognitive processes are involved in being that charismatic adult, but even effective therapist, effective parent, effective educator, or effective boss, name it.
But you know what? I'll just say one thing, because you said something very interesting. The first step is how we manage our own feelings before we
yes, of course,
with others, because Daniel Goleman, what he said is a basic foundation of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. Are you aware of what triggers your feelings and how you handle them? And, one of the things I've often said to people, it's very easy to be empathic and understanding towards those people whose ideas totally agree with our own. Or it's very easy to be empathic towards kids who really listen all the time to us. I don't know if that's ever possible. And I say the true test of empathy, which I learned when I was running a school in a locked door unit of a psychiatric hospital. True test of empathy is to be empathic when you're upset, annoyed, or disappointed in another person. And, we could be very frustrated with kids, but if that frustration leads us not to be empathic and to assume that, the kid is, as one parent said, out to get me, we're going to have a lot, of difficulty in really reaching and working with that child.
Bob, these are just fascinating topics, and I know you could talk on these topics for hours, and I'm so sorry to have such a short time with you. But as we come to an end, I wanted to ask you a question that is there any relationship between resilience and creativity? I find that people who bounce back are really good with problem solving, and the way they circumvent, they have a way to see a potential in the when they see a door closed, they actually begin to look for a window and a crack. They have the capacity to convert the crack into a window. You know what I mean? So do
Yes.
you know anything of that sort, or how
Well,
do we understand it?
Yeah, I don't know the research exactly. I know once reading some papers on creativity, even people's views of creativity could differ greatly. Just like when I co-edited a book on called Handbook of Resilience in Children, I was, certainly learned a lot how different people even view the concept of resilience. But if we view creativity as you said, really as being able to see things that had not been seen before, as really being very flexible, whatever, and looking at different options and being good problem solvers, I would say then it does go along with the same characteristics that go into being resilient. Because to be resilient, you've got to be able to think of solutions that you may not have thought about before. You've got to think about different options. You've also, to be creative, I almost think you have to have a sense of hope that there are other solutions out there. And part of being resilient is being hopeful. And creativity also involves, for me, that if one is creative, you're gonna fall on your face several times as you try different things. And people often talk about the light bulb in Edison, and how many mistakes were made before the light bulb was developed. You have to have a mindset that says, each time I fail, I have to learn from this, and what is it that I could do differently next time. And, some of my readings of creativity, that's a very basic part of being creative. So I would say, yes, there would be some link in terms of the characteristics, certainly, of a creative person and one who is resilient.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for your wisdom and your patience and most amazing way of describing complex matter. Thank you for being on the podcast today. And I can't wait to have you again for the second part where we discuss some parts of parenting. So thank you so much again.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your wonderful examples and insights.
All right. Well, Sucheta, as we both suspected, fascinating conversation with Dr. Brooks. Gosh, whole new appreciation for this idea of resilience. Any initial thoughts about it?
Yeah, resilience is one of the best ways to describe executive function, the positiveness with which we adapt when executive functions emerge or are most finessed. That's what resilience looks like. So American Psychological Association defines resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. In short, it is one's ability to bounce back from difficult experiences, as Bob was talking about. Now, the difficult experiences can range from conflict within the family, or tumultuous relationships, serious illness, or chronic ongoing health crisis, or even workplace pressures and financial stressors. All that can contribute to that distress, which requires adaptive response and bouncing back from. Now, when the research process began, or particularly in the psychological literature, it talks about more serious threats from which one needs to bounce back. But resilience can be put to test in an everyday process as well. You trying to, take a shortcut and then to come to find out that the tree has fallen down, or you leave the house in a hurry and then you get into your car and then come to do groceries and find that you left your wallet at home. So those are kinds of things that are adversities. They may not be tragedies and they may not cause significant threat, but you do need to bounce back from that. So research has shown that people, by and large, are resilient, and resilience is remarkably ordinary response to life's condition. And being human means to err, which also brings sadness, disappointment, and pain. And from that, we need to rise like a phoenix. Being resilient doesn't mean it eradicates negative experiences or blocks off adversity, but rather it means that you get inoculated from negative impact of that and become stress hardy. So finally, the conversation with Bob kind of triggered a lot of thoughts that researchers and psychologists agree that resilience is not a personality trait, which means it's not you either have it or you don't, but rather it's developed as an ability, and it entails responding to distressful situations with skillful behaviors and actions with great finesse and expertise. So yes, just like any skill, you can practice it and you can get better at it. But if you don't have the skill because you haven't practiced it, you may be very amateur at it.
Well, walk us through how to define or understand when our resilience is actually put to the test.
Yeah, so there are adversities or roadblocks, as I was talking about earlier, that cause you to have to adjust. And if it's not significant tragedy and adversity or stress-induced challenge, then what is it? For ordinary everyday life, I think it's the mistakes. To me, the biggest source of stress is the mistakes we made. And that making of mistakes and rising from those mistakes, whether you accept the mistakes, whether you say, oh, my bad, I need to respond in a different way, or you course correct because of the mistake, or you completely change the way you are pursuing goals. All that requires, testing your resilience or putting your adaptive mind to perform well. But what I like about framing executive function or adaptive skills from the lens of resilience, that it also encompasses mindset. So it's not just what you do, but what you feel about what you do and how you think and how you behave continuously based on how you feel about things. And that's what it means to check whether you're resilient or not. Particularly in the context of children, what parents and teachers have to really work on and put their own resilience to test, or watch the child's resilience being put to test, is hold back the urge to rush and rescue the child. And what best to witness is to see the child think, how he thinks before he acts, how he anticipates, and how he considers all the options in front of. So those are the everyday situations that put our resilience to test. And witnessing someone else's adaptability is the way you learn to hold back your reaction and bring out your response.
Well, I'm still thinking about this idea of resilience being a developable skill, right? I mean, so this resilient mindset, I mean, it really is critical to understand it, because everyone's going to have challenges and issues, and we've got to cultivate and test this so that we understand our capability, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is my third takeaway for our listeners. I would love to summarize it as well. What are the components, as Bob was talking about? What are the components of resilient mindset? And his work, along with Dr. Sam Goldstein, who I have had as my guest, they talk very specifically and lay this out. Here's 4 components of that resilient mindset. Number 1 is they have a strong sense of meaning and purpose, that this exactly anchors them to onto their path and reminds them every step of the way, particularly when they're making mistakes or having to handle roadblocks, that they are on this path, and the obstacles that they're encountering are to be expected and to be sidelined or moved out of the way, so that you can continue to stay on this path. So to me, this is like the perspective that somebody who has great resilient mindset has, that their actions are driven by meaning and purpose. The second thing is such students, children, or adults are driven to making a positive difference in the life of others. So this also is part of that empathic mindset, that how do I offer my actions to others, and how do I join this greater mission to serve the greater good. The third is that they are far better equipped to deal with mistakes. They see mistakes as something, as Bob was saying, to learn and grow from, and not as a personal folly. And it's not indicative of a permanent state of life, but it's a temporary state of adjustment. And the fourth part that makes up the resilient mindset is they're very good at coming up with most effective coping strategies. They're adjusting and adapting, but in the most resourceful way. They're not just trying to get through, but they're coming to the other side with a great smile on their face. A resilient mind has a far greater sense of personal control, particularly in challenging situations and crises. And this sense of control leads to thinking about the obstacles much more clearly and optimistically. It leads to engaging in innovative problem solving. And finally, it brings about the necessary adaptive shift. And that's so important for all of us to think about, because when we talk about training, this is what we are training children to develop.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating stuff. But I also want you to go into something else here. Ever since you mentioned Jaime Escalante at the top of the show and defined him as a charismatic adult, I've been thinking about the people who had influence on me over my life, and I guess I would define them also as charismatic adults. Talk more about that and how you would actually define that.
Yeah, charismatic adult. That's one of my favorite, takeaways from this discussion with Bob. He writes a monthly article, and I will be attaching that resource on my website here. But he talks about Julius Siegel's work, and he describes, I'm quoting, that he devoted much of his life as a psychologist to exploring what helps at-risk youngsters to survive and thrive. Wrote a brief article in 1988 for Brown University Child Behavior and Development newsletter. And in that, he defines charismatic adult as a person with whom they can identify and from whom they gather strength. So a charismatic adult offers safety, security, unconditional acceptance, which contributes to the child feeling assured. And it's proven to be a critical element of success within school. So why don't we focus on becoming charismatic adult as we serve children, or as we teach them, mentor them, raise them even? So what would that look like? In the school context, a student who develops a close and nurturing relationship with at least one caring adult has shown to have tremendous impact for that student. And if a child comes from a high-stress home environment or of abuse or neglect with instability, unpredictability, and general uncertainty, if that child is assured that there is someone whom he or she knows and can turn to, and who will act as an advocate or will be a champion for that child, imagine the comfort and ease that child is going to experience. So parents and teachers must first and foremost recognize and appreciate the extent to which their presence has an influence on the child's inner well-being. And secondly, they can prioritize such that they use their influence to enrich the spaces within which the child lives and operates. And not just one, but all situations. This reminds me of a story of a famous makeup artist, Bobbi Brown, who now took her company to a stage of success where it's worth billions of dollars. But when she was in college in Arizona, one day she came home and sat at the kitchen table and said to her mom that I don't like school, Mom. It's boring. And what ensued is a perfect example of becoming that charismatic parent that I'm talking about. So, the mom heard her loud and clear, and instead of saying, suck it up and move on, go back to school. Semester was about to start in a week or two. She said something wonderful. She said, forget everything. If today was your birthday and if you could do anything, how would you spend your day? And Bobbi Brown thought for a minute and immediately replied that I would go to the largest department store, this was in suburbs of Chicago, and play with makeup. So mom declared, then that's what you're going to do. And Bobbi Brown was so surprised, and she said, that's what I'm going to do? Is there a school for it? And so mom said, we'll find out. And so that's what a charismatic adult is able to do, is infusing this optimism and promise so that the child feels that there's hope and there's a way to affect that control over one's life, which is, of course, leads to motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic.
Great stuff. I'm going to be thinking a lot about this idea of charismatic adults long after we wrap this episode. Great stuff. And I'm still thinking about what I mentioned earlier is I'm still noodling on this notion that resiliency is a skill that you can develop. So talk more about that. Talk about how you actually train for resilience. And what does that training look like?
Yeah. So as you know, Todd, I love to summarize these profound discussions that I get to have with these incredible speakers. And Bob is truly a wealth of knowledge, and his advice resources that he's produced are really worth everybody's time. And so I get a chance to condense his message as well as the advice that I have gathered from other incredible speakers. And I find teaching children, adolescents, or adults to face obstacles with great preparedness so that the confidence can be built is the process that we as professionals need to master. And so I often get, when I was younger clinician, I often got this question asked that, we are not psychologists. How can we counsel? And I find this a strange question. Counsel to me is giving advice that leads to preparedness and building of skills. So giving advice that leads to building of skills is what I do. And I find that a few things that need to be done is, one, to become more tolerant of frustration and sense of anxiety and sense of anger or fear that gets invoked in you when you make mistakes. So that's the first skills training needs to happen. Second is to teach children, adolescents, or adults this problem-solving mindset, how to evaluate a problematic condition and how to generate multiple solutions and put them to test. So just like a dry run, try them out one by one and then make the determination which is the best solution. The third that comes to my mind is coping strategies, how to effectively cope and shift strategies in midst of coping and really not really believe that if things are not going well, then you are not using the best coping methods. Just some of the examples that come to my mind is I once read that the Newton South High School in Massachusetts, which is, it's in New England, as you can imagine, in Boston, and there are so many Ivy League schools as well as top-notch schools, and 12th grade students can feel the pressure of getting admitted to these top schools. And so they created a bulletin board called Wall of Shame. And what they invited the students to do is tack those rejection letters to this wall of shame. So it's clearly displayed and visible. So the failure is not indication of you having failed as a person, but you having received a unfavorable response. And that's what it's all about, or that's where it needs to be. Bob writes this in his article, that seniors rejected from MIT now have this web, MIT counselors and staff have created this words of reassurance and sympathy, where there's an online blog that people who got rejected can share their disappointment, and so they get to vent. And once that you vent, it's cleared and it's out of your system. So, what a way to kind of train yourself to get through these difficult times.
Yeah, no kidding. Gosh. Lots of takeaways here. A lot of game-changing takeaways. Any final thoughts before we wrap this week's episode?
Yeah, my conversation with Bob made me think a lot about this important topic. So here's what I would say: that we are all searching for, craving for, longing for, and aiming for a state of equilibrium. Where we are in harmony with ourselves and with our surroundings. Life has this inbuilt program to restore itself. And we see that in nature. We have resilient trees, forests, corals, habitats. There are resilient structures, systems, even organizations. And above all, there is resiliency in humans. Children, couples, families, and even communities can inculcate, exhibit, and finesse their response to distress. So what do they all have in common? If we ask that question, this is what comes to my mind. They have this internal elasticity to bounce back. These individuals and systems revitalize themselves with the help and support from something greater than themselves, and that is life's purpose. And the stress doesn't break them down. They are stress hardy. So there are mentors or charismatic adults that promote the emergence of resilience, and then there are internal qualities that makes it easy for individuals to adapt successfully. And we all are responsible in fostering resilience in others, particularly children, but we must also take a look at ourselves and find out what are those internal qualities that makes us adapt successfully. So changing one's own ways is critical here. It's easy to tell someone to change, but it's quite a quest to take a hard look at oneself, and it requires to be flexible and understanding. It takes patience and hard work, and that's why making change in self is the highest form of resilience. And implementing this change is very hard. And so not to minimize difficult obstacles one is going to run into, like my conversation with Carol Tavris, we talked about cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is one fundamental block in making a change in oneself when we face mistakes or when we find this internal conflict that rubs us the wrong way. But the reasons for self-change are abundant. It will enrich our personal relationship. It will bring peace and harmony. We will have more partners who can aid in our effort to achieve goals and attain success. And above all, it will help us elevate our lives. And that's, to me, the most willing person who has demonstrated resilience to make changes in oneself is the charismatic adult. So isn't that win and win for all?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, goodness gracious. Lucky you and me, we get to have Dr. Brooks on the show again next week. Can't wait for that one. That's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thank you for tuning in and listening today, and we look forward to seeing you again next week for our second conversation with Dr. Bob Brooks. We'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.